Any participants?
We do. We have 6 panelists and 11 attendees.
Okay.
So 17 total. Yeah, which is great.
Sure. So I'll just get started with a little speech and then hand it over to you, Molly. Hello, everybody. My name is Mike DeLume with the International Arctic Research Center in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I will be managing the chat and the Zoom technical aspects of everything. So you should be able to contact me if you should have any technical issues in the bottom right-hand corner of your panel by messaging the ASSW meeting monitor. Additionally, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you may be. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of indigenous people with whom we engage. With that in mind, let's keep an open mind and community building and collaboration as described in the ASSW Code of Conduct, which we shall share in this chat window. Some logistics before we start. If this is your first session joining us, you joined with your camera off and your audio muted. You can unmute yourself at any time, but please remember to remute yourself after speaking. You can do that by clicking the mute button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen or pressing *6 if you're on the phone. Please avoid echo by using headphones or a headset when possible. You see your controls by hovering over the bottom of your screen, and if you have a question, please either raise your hand, I'll be monitoring that function, or you can chat to me in the bottom of your screen. If you don't have a mic, you can type your question or comment into the chat, and I will read that out loud. This presentation is being recorded and will be available later as on the AOS2020agenda.org website, as well as on YouTube. And that's all. I am happy to hand it over to our moderator for today, Molly McCann. Molly, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Now, do I need to do anything at all?
No, you're good to go.
I'm good to go. Okay. Well, I want to welcome everybody to this panel. I know it's some challenging time zones, but I've been really impressed with the dedication that everyone has to participating in these. We have some really, I think, some really interesting talks here that will be focusing on observing needs, focusing on Indigenous, private sector, and science needs. I think originally we had 5 people scheduled to talk tonight, this morning, but I think there's some some connectivity issues with one of our panelists, so I think we have 4 speakers. The plan tonight is that we will hear from a speaker and then have any questions right after that talk, and then after the 4 talks themselves, then have maybe a broader discussion after that. We are scheduled for 1.5 hours, and so I think we should just get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephanie Russo-Carroll. She is an Ahtna and Sicilian descent woman from Alaska, based at the University of Arizona, where she's an assistant professor of public health. And her research explores the links between governance, data, the environment, and community wellness. And Stephanie was asked to speak on her perspective on approaches and priorities to increase the efficiency, reach, and impact of observations in support of Indigenous engagement in climate research. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my slides. Okay, well, Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishusta, Slandak Nalchina. Welcome, I'm Stephanie Russo-Carroll. I'm Ahtna, a citizen of the native village of Kugluktuk along the Copper River in Alaska. I'm talking to you today from the unceded homelands of the Tohono Nation and the lands of the Pascua Yaqui tribe on which the University of Arizona sits. I'm going to share with you a bit about the significance of Indigenous data sovereignty for climate research and resilience. And this is work that I do on behalf of the university, but also through 2 networks, the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, as well as the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Indigenous peoples have always been scientists and data experts, observing, collecting, storing, analyzing, and using deep place-based knowledge. The ongoing processes of colonization have oppressed, suppressed, and co-opted Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. Indigenous data are information and knowledge in any format that impact Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at the collective and the individual levels. So it's data about our resources and our environments, data about us as individuals, and data about us as peoples and nations. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. This concept derives from inherent rights to govern people's lands and resources, and finds genesis in our traditions, roles, and responsibilities in our communities for how we hold, transmit, and use our knowledge. It is positioned within a human rights framework and leverages court cases, treaties, recognitions of all sorts, but is not dependent on any of those, since its grounding is in inherent rights. And it is fundamental to who we are as peoples. So one of the examples that I like to use and talk about methodologies and methods and how they affect how we work with climate and climate resilience is through the suppression and co-optation of knowledge that occurred after a mine tilling spill into a river that runs through the Navajo Nation here in Arizona and Mexico. And thinking through how the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency looked at what the exposure pathways were for risk to humans and how they presented it just solely as a hiker. And so this US EPA perspective of a hiker being exposed to the water through consumption provides a prime example of colonization, erasure, and politics impacting the methodology or the ways of knowing that inform the design of a project or the response to an issue, and as well as the methods or the tools used to assess and measure. In contrast, a community-driven process that the DINÉ and allied scientists, mainstream and tribal colleges, tribal and community organizations, and youth and elders utilize local DINÉ knowledge and knowledge systems to inform the methodologies, so how they went about conceptualizing what needed to be assessed as a risk, and the methods, so the community events, the family sharing, and so on and so forth, and assessed over 40 exposure pathways instead of the single pathway that the US EPA was using, and then was able to utilize those through research processes and policy practices. One of the things I like to point out is that here you see that not all 40 pathways are there, and that's an act of Indigenous data governance. So some of those are shared and some are not shared, and you can change levels of sharing as climate needs and other issues like we're presented with today come up. So what we see in this example is a shift from no community engagement, no Indigenous engagement, to a Indigenous process centered in Indigenous values and historical context, where the collective has authority over the process and is leading the process. So my colleague, postdoc that I work with, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, found in her dissertation research that the vast majority of climate studies practice an extractive model, so really far on the right side of the model, with minimal participation or decision-making authority from communities who hold the knowledge there. In follow-up to that study, Dominique provides a guide based on the New UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other ethics documents from the US and abroad for assessing what does a responsible engagement process with Indigenous people look like. And these questions remind us of the importance of following community ethics in addition to discipline and personal ethics when we're performing research and observing and looking to solve really large issues. And creating a dialogue of knowledges to address our most pressing challenges, upholding Indigenous community authority and consent, and respecting intellectual property rights. This guide also aligns with the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance that came out last September. These principles of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics work alongside open science and open data principles to center people and purpose in data conversations for Indigenous peoples by providing a framework for engagement with respect to their data. But what do these frameworks and principles look like as policies and practices? This is where we are in terms of beginning to implement these globally, but also locally. And some emerging efforts include setting Indigenous data standards within different disciplines, but also broadly across sciences and other collection efforts, creating traditional knowledge and biocultural metadata labels that inserts provenance and transparency through the data lifecycle, particularly as we work in these environments where data are put into large secondary data sets and we move to and are pressured towards open science to be able to do it on Indigenous terms in Indigenous ways and to follow that provenance through the data lifecycle. And then utilizing researcher and collection notices to indicate willingness to collaborate around these efforts to indicate provenance and control by Indigenous peoples. And finally, I just like to always leave you by underscoring that we all have a role to play. I think, as we all know, as Indigenous scholars in our own communities or Indigenous scholars working with other communities or allied scholars, and advancing Indigenous sovereignty and making space for dialogues of ways of knowing that support climate resilience, whether it's their role as a collaborating researcher, governments sitting at the table with Indigenous governments, or funders and publishers, including Indigenous scholars, as grant or publication reviewers. And so I really like to challenge people to make sure that you're always speaking up at tables and making the invisible visible.
Thank you, Stephanie. Do we have any questions from any of our attendees or the other panelists too? Any questions for Stephanie? I think you can either raise your hand or you can put something in the chat. Is there anything right now? Okay. Actually, if no one's going to ask a question, then I will. Stephanie, so one of the, if you could just comment on how, what is your perspective? What is the perspective of Indigenous kind of self-control of data, data sovereignty, if the data collection is funded using, let's just say, public federal money or state money or something like that, which traditionally is considered completely open public access? How do you view that kind of data collection and data?
Yeah, so that really exemplifies the role of relationships and having strong relationships and moving from a space where control was wrenched away or suppressed from Indigenous hands and having no control over our own data, to really coming to a place where we can work through what it might look like for Indigenous people. And I think some of the concern, and I dabble in some bioethics work around genomics data. And so there's been an explosion lately because the NIH has a project that really bungled how it was engaging with tribes and took way too long to do tribal engagement. And the impact of that at the NIH, which is such a large entity, and I think we will see the ripple effects out of that, is that a crisis has emerged, but the plus of the crisis is it now is making all of these different institutes there have to think through together what it means to have a data sharing policy and how what the impacts are for relationships with tribes. And because we're particularly concerned in whether it be genomics or climate or wherever, that we don't have the ability to have Indigenous identifiers or provenance information in data sets. So while you also have a lack of control, you have a lack of participation. And so you see, as we get more and more data, the slice of Indigenous data shrinks. And so there's a need for Indigenous people to be participating on Indigenous terms and a desire to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I don't see any questions right at the moment. So why don't we go to our, Oh, we
We
do?
do have one more question here. Hayo Aiken poses the question, how do you see collaboration with private sector or public government data service providers, archival, et cetera, in archiving of Indigenous data? And are there good examples or bad examples?
I think so. In terms of looking to other countries and successes that are going on in other countries, there's some significant movement forward and co-production of data policy within New Zealand, and I think particularly because of New Zealand's stance in terms of wanting to be a top data mover and shaker globally. And so you have Maori co-production of those data policies and standards. Some of those actually just came out recently. And so you see embedded within the processes of making data open Maori values and Maori control in those systems. I think here, what we have a strength in traditionally in the US has been particularly around museum and library collections and beginning to insert controls into those types of collections and repositories, and to, in the absence of being able to have items repatriated, which is obviously a significant issue, be able to exert some sort of provenance and presence within that so that people can't just go in and use information and knowledge. And one of those was some of the first, or actually the first recording that the US government owns is a recording of the Passamaquoddy tribe from a tribal woman. And they were not able to have that given back to them, but within the metadata of the storage of that item, it was, they're able to put their provenance information in there, significant information about traditional knowledge and who can access that knowledge, when it can be accessed, and permissioning of that knowledge. And so I think there's a real need to look across disciplines for what's already existing.
Okay, did you have a follow-up on that, Haya? While you're thinking about that, there's a question from Sean Topcock. Are you collaborating, sharing data with the Center for Alaska Native Health Research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks?
No, I have not. I have been working with the South Central Foundation and others more in the South.
Okay. And Hayo did ask that if you have a link to a publication on the Maori example, that would be appreciated.
I'll put it in the chat box.
Okay, put it in the chat box. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks. And I think a comment from Kelly, thank you for the presentation. This is the first time I've heard of the CARE principles, which actually I just heard about the CARE principles for the first time about a month ago. And so I've been really interested to learn more about them as well. So thank you. Anything else for Stephanie here? Okay, why don't we go on to our next speaker then. Dr. Olivia Lee is an assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center at University of Alaska Fairbanks. She's currently working at the intersection of observing marine and coastal ecosystem change through collaborations with Indigenous coastal communities and the use of satellite remote sensing tools. Her work is currently focused on the Northern Bering Sea and the North Slope of Alaska. Olivia was asked to highlight her perspective on leveraging available resources to facilitate sustained observations that have an impact on decision-making in relation to the work that she's been doing to build a coastal observing program in Arctic Alaska. So Olivia, I think you have the control, so.
Great, and it seems like quite a few folks who are here live are actually familiar, so I think this might go fairly quickly. For those of you who don't know me, I am involved with a couple of projects based on Bering Strait region and the North Slope of Alaska. One is the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook. One is the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub. Both of these really, we emphasize allowing or expecting collaborations with coastal communities to basically take the lead on reporting what observations are most relevant to them. Typically they are linked to subsistence harvest activities. We do provide some guidance on what we as scientists would be interested in with respect to weather and changes in sea ice. And for my perspective, being a marine mammal biologist, I'm really keen in seeing all of the changes that communities are observing with respect to migratory behavior of particularly ice seals and walruses. What I really appreciate about working with coastal communities is the fact that they give us a point of view that we can't really get from really any other type of observing data that we're currently collecting. From the Pan-Arctic scale, we are able to track changes in sea ice, but when it comes down to how does that matter for decision making, you can't get a handle of that until you actually see what that means at the local scale. And here's an example of changes between the spring and late summer months in sea ice conditions. Over in the Kugluktuk region, they're really seeing a lot more of these polar bears that used to be able to stay offshore on the sea ice coming onto land, and that having impacts with greater interactions between community members and polar bears coming on shore. With a lack of sea ice in the region too, we're seeing potential for more migration of species from the south moving up north, and also potentially increasing connectivity for species across the Arctic, where sea ice used to be more of a barrier between regions within the Arctic itself. So here's just a quick plug for, again, how local communities give us really relevant information on changes in sea ice. On the left is a model output taken for a month in advance forecast for ice over in St. Lawrence Island, expecting at the end or the beginning of May for there to be almost no sea ice around St. Lawrence Island. But when you talk to community members, they're seeing a fair bit of ice, and ice that is actually still usable habitat for animals like walruses. So again, if we can also leverage local communities to help improve some of these sea ice models, to improve the predictability of the models, that can help with planning. If communities can have a little bit more say in how some of the conditions that might maybe improve model predictions, they could then think about planning for how long potentially their hunting season might be, because there is or won't be any ice left. Again, this is an unusual mortality event in the Alaska region, the gray whales and the ice seals. A lot of the reported locations for the ice seal strandings came from local communities. Without them, we just don't have the observing infrastructure to tell us where ice seals are being found. And also because I think we don't have communities out in the open ocean, we don't know what's happening to some of the more pelagic species like the ribbon seals. They're not part of this mass mortality event because nobody is observing them. And we don't know if that's because they're doing well or because no one is finding them. My last couple of slides are just basically thinking about how we can leverage existing observations to improve the kind of information we might need to use for decision making. I think there's an opportunity to work more closely with the air travel industry, the remote community air travel pilots and people traveling between communities could potentially give us a little bit more observations about animals that they're seeing in ice conditions. If there's ability to, again, keep leveraging remote sensing data of snow and sea ice over key habitat areas. We do have, through the AOK project, coastal water observations, but there's a possibility that we could improve how many communities are able to contribute those types of observations. And then, of course, because marine mammals are so closely linked to benthic prey species, there's an ability to leverage other marine traffic to help collect a little bit more data. It's a little bit sparse. I think that's something that we haven't really been able to do successfully, and I don't know what a framework like for that might look like. And then finally, whatever observations we are collecting, if it's going to be useful for decision making, we really need to make sure we come up with a way to communicate the information back to communities in a format that is useful and usable and accessible to them. And of course, none of this would be possible without a vast number of community collaborators. And if anyone has any questions, my email is on there as well.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for Olivia? I guess maybe a question that I would have just to start it off is, I think you ended by saying just the value of having this kind of information for decision making, but how do you make that connection to what decisions are being made and what information is needed? Do you start with the decisions that are being made and then look for what observations are needed, or do you start with the observations and tie them to potential decisions? And what is your perspective on that?
That's a tough one, Molly. What we've done is obviously start with observations and hope that they will then contribute to some decision making. But I think there's value also in going the other way with starting of what decisions do we need to make, and what is the sort of information and observations we require to make those decisions. I think for long-term planning, there's definitely that value for being very strategic about what types of observations you need that need to be long-term, that can help you inform whatever community long-term planning needs are. But for day-to-day, I think it's a little bit more complicated. You need to have a very rapid response from observation to information dissemination. That I think, government agencies like National Weather Service are still best set up to serve those kinds of needs.
Okay. We do have a comment from Lisa Liceto. Great talk. Is the information, traditional knowledge collected from communities in regards to why animals may be washing up in the unexplained mortality events?
I think they have some ideas. I don't think that any community or traditional knowledge explanation is widely accepted, which is why they're working closely with scientists to do testing of toxins, harmful algal bloom potentially, but also looking at lipid content. A lot of the animals were actually emaciated, and because for the ice seals at least, you were seeing animals across age groups washing up, so it wasn't just young animals that were particularly affected, but it was mature animals as well. So it's something very unusual, and it would be great. I think that the stranding network of NOAA works really closely with communities, so I think it's a joint effort to try to understand what's going on here.
And certainly communities are going to be the ones who see stranded animals first and can report them and have some kind of clue as to what's going on there. But yeah. Any other questions for Olivia? I guess one other question that I have, Olivia, too, is do you have a way of putting the information that you're getting from the two projects into developing some kind of a time series to see trends or change over time?
We have just very simple web archive for the CIS4WAR's Outlook, and we are trying to develop a knowledge hub through the AOK project, but we are definitely seeking partners, and Molly AUS is on our radar, at least for some of the data, the CTD type of data, to keep that trend, time series type of information, because it matters how it's presented too,
Yeah. Good, and I think we have a question from Kelly Ulick. She asked, does AAOKH incentivize and compensate community members for providing observations? How can we get these observations into the hands of agencies to incorporate with their observing networks?
Oh yeah, I'll put in the chat the database, which is linked to ILOCA. And yes, we do compensate our observers. I don't think we compensate them enough for what they do, but that's a work in progress. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? And Kelly says, apologies, she's on her phone. Any other questions for Olivia? Okay, thanks very much. And we hope you'll stand by and through the rest of the talks. Our next talk is from Professor Michael Tjernström. Michael is a professor of meteorology at Stockholm University, Sweden, with over 35 years of research experience with both modeling and observations, the last 20 years focusing on the Arctic. He was asked for a presentation highlighting the substantial assessment activity of Arctic observations within the INTAROS project, which is a European Commission project, as well as any additional perspectives specifically on how Arctic Observing Summit participants can support the higher level recommendations for future improvements of an integrated Arctic observing system. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. You can hear me, I hope. So this will be somewhat different since in this project we have tried to do an assessment of the existing observation networks. And although there is a work package in the project about traditional knowledge, I will not touch upon that. So this will be a little bit different than the previous presentations. So we thought that there's something you can learn about how to set up an Arctic observing network from looking at what works and what doesn't work in the present observations. And also we need to know what the gaps are. So the start of this whole thing was a big survey that is based on 3 questionnaires on existing observing systems, data collections, and both in situ, and also about Arctic satellite products. We also performed some modest model studies because of resources and also some evaluations, especially about satellite data. And I'd like to say already now here that no project is big enough to actually capture all the different observations that are out there. So this is, I would say, a representative subset of Arctic observations. So this is what we ended up with. This is just an overview over all the observation systems that were assessed. You see it's denser in certain areas and less dense in other areas. And you might not find your own observation station in here because it wasn't part of the questionnaires. And if you go into looking at the different spheres, you'll find for the atmosphere, climate monitoring and climate services are the most common use, process-oriented research, and then comes various forms of operational services. If you go to oceans and sea ice, you see the same thing essentially. Only environmental assessment is coming up as a major user, and for the land and terrestrial cryosphere, there's also risk assessment. But climate in general comes very high on the usage of these observations. And when you start looking at the gaps, we decided to split it up into the marine environment and terrestrial environment because of, well, of obvious reasons. And of course, then there's an atmosphere over both, but ocean and sea ice is only in the marine environment and vice versa. And when it comes to the atmosphere in the marine environment, there's almost everything's a gap. Especially there's almost no information at all about vertical structure of the atmosphere or about clouds. And we find that satellite retrievals, especially of clouds and profiling, are inadequate. They are not able to fill that gap. In the ocean and sea ice, under the ice is the big thing. There's difficulties in doing observations of the vertical structure under the ice, or not so much doing the observations, but to communicate them. So the logistics is a big issue. There's also a big lack of biochemical and biological observations, long time moorings, and sea ice thickness is still a struggle, and snow on the ice. In the terrestrial environment, the gaps are slightly different. It's more a matter of quality than of extent or denseness of the networks. So there's certain parts of the Arctic where there are observations, but the quality is not good enough. And there's also gaps in the Russian Arctic when it comes to trace gas and trace gas fluxes. For the land and the cryosphere, snow cover and snow properties, glacier and ice sheet mass balance, and also here improved characterization of satellite products. And very many of these observation systems actually do excellent observations, but we don't have access to near real-time observations, so there's less use of them than could be. We also did an evaluation of some of the, rather detailed evaluation of some of the characteristics of these observation systems, and in terms of data management, the sustainability, uncertainty, and metadata and documentation. So we asked the people filling in the questionnaires to rate all these different aspects. And then you can do a map like this, and I'm not asking you to read anything in here, but you can start to aggregate things, and in this particular case, it's the terrestrial stations in the Arctic, and they're grouped according to sustainability. And then you see a pattern, and those patterns you can learn something from. So if I go directly to the synthesis and recommendations, we find that high sustainability is a proxy for high scores across the board. And that most systems that has a high sustainability are coming from national, regional, or global infrastructures that are often not Arctic specific. So I think we're too obsessed with building an Arctic network. There are excellent networks already in place on a national, regional, and global level, and we should focus on doing the observations and getting involved with these already existing networks. We also find that the very best data you can get are the data you get from campaigns or icebreaker expeditions into the Arctic Ocean, but they are deficient in almost every other aspect, and that's because they're not sustained. So we need to revisit the funding models for these activities and increase the coordination between operational and scientific organizations so that we raise the level of data management, for instance, coming from this type of activity. So the lack in data management is not because scientists are generally poor at organizing things. It's just because they don't really have to do a good job about it, because they're going to have to write a new proposal for the next expedition anyway. Satellite provides the only data with sufficient spatial and temporal cover, but they don't have the quality. So we need to invest in better satellite retrievals and improved models and data simulations. Which brings me to the conclusion for the Arctic Ocean. So there's a lack of in situ observing capacity across all disciplines. And I think we are never going to see a solution to that problem because of the logistic issues in the Arctic Ocean. So I think we need to see a paradigm shift where the comprehensive level of observations are actually replaced by model reanalysis supported by mostly satellite observations. And the satellite observations are then the baseline observation network, and the field experiment correspond to the reference level. Over land, it's more a quality issue. We need to upgrade and complement existing stations rather than expanding new networks. And we need to deploy new technology at the places where we already have observations. So anyone that are interested can read the complete synthesis and recommendation report. It's much longer than this, and I just scratched the surface here, and that'll take any questions you'll have.
Thank you, Michael. Any questions for Michael? Okay, well, I'm going to ask a question since I read the
thank you.
paper. And I guess my question is, what is the connection then between the assessment and synthesis that INTAROS did and the one that SAON has done? Because SAON has also done kind of an assessment of observing systems and done a survey and a questionnaire of those. How do you see those two dovetailing or working together?
Well, I think they're complementary. I think that we started out at a slightly different, from a different point of view. I mean, we have a funded project, and therefore all the participants in that project were mandated to actually go in and fill out these the questionnaires rather in detail. If you put out a questionnaire there and it's as detailed as the one that we have, the risk is that if you're just asking for volunteers to fill it out, it will not be done as accurately and as detailed as we were managed to do. The backside of that is, of course, that we're not covering everything. We're basically mostly covering observation systems that are either driven or operated by or known to the members, the partners in the project. And therefore, we're now opening it up. Now we have a substantial part of the observation. It really makes good sense for anyone that's interested to go in and also complement and fill in these questionnaires, even though they're not part of INTAROS. And that is the next step. So we'll get more observation stations in there. So I think the degree of detail here is the thing that makes this unique. And it also allows us then to do a very detailed analysis.
And do you have plans for sustaining that that database and that synthesis? Do you see that as a long-term effort? We see that
as a living database, and we're right now there is a project in Norway where the Norwegian government is funding a continuation of this data set, and we're looking for ways to keep this alive for the I wouldn't say indefinitely because no one knows about indefinitely, but for a long time. And it should be a living document where not only new participants come in and enter their information, but also the old participants keep the information updated as things change.
Okay. And we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. One is from Vito Vitali in Italy. Do you talk about clusterization of collected information? Can you say a little bit more about that?
You mean as a part of the assessment? Yeah. So what we did was actually the very first attempt was looking at the sustainability. So you look at all the observation system that has a high sustainability. Do they have something else in common? And it shows up that that they do. If you were to look at the opposite, unsustained observation systems, I bet you'll see similar things. So there's a lot more you can do with this data, but we just started in that end. So this is essentially learning from existing system what works and what doesn't work, and then we find that if you sustain a system, you're very more likely to also put in the effort to do good data management. If you have an unsustained effort like a field campaign or an icebreaker expedition, you're much less likely to have good data management because it doesn't really matter. It's not going to be there for the long term anyway. And that's the wrong approach, but that's the way people see it.
So a question from Larry Hinsman. How can we advance international contributions to sustained observations?
Well, that can be done in very, very many different ways, of course, but I think it's different for different fields also. But I think in very many areas, it's more a matter of going out and trying to solve the technological problems that are associated with observing in the Arctic and trying to get those observations into the existing observing systems rather than inventing a new Arctic-specific observing system. Another benefit from doing it that way would be that the global community, the global climate community, as an example, would get more interested in the Arctic than they have been previously. I think it's more a matter of finding the right global or regional partner than trying to set up something new and unique for the Arctic.
Well, I know that at the Ocean Obs 19 conference in Honolulu last fall, that the major gap that was identified there for the climate community was the Arctic. So maybe there will be more interest now.
Yeah, but let me take an example in the ocean. Since I'm not an oceanographer, I know just about enough about the ocean to become really dangerous. But there is a lack of observation of ocean structure under the ice, right? That doesn't mean that the Argus system is the wrong system. The Argus system is exactly the right system, but it doesn't work in the Arctic because you cannot communicate the observations from under the ice out to the satellite. So that's a technological problem, and you need to solve that problem rather than inventing a new network.
So from Ikaarvik, who do you see as the primary audience of this assessment? Is there a formal acknowledgement of gaps you identified by national governments or the European Union?
Well, the European Union is the obvious customer for a European Union project, but anyone else that are interested can, of course, learn. So it's mostly policymakers and governments and at that sort of level. Also funding agencies, I would say. I think the funding agencies today are too lax in their requirements for instance, for data management for field campaigns. They require the data to be published openly, but they don't really care how it's done and what the quality is. And that is not fixed by new regulations. It's fixed by dedicated money.
Okay, another question from Kelly Ulick. With increased vessel traffic through Arctic waters, can we use ships as platforms for increased atmospheric and physical oceanography sampling? Is anyone already doing this?
A really good question. That's another issue that we try to push in this report, is the fact that they should actually be prohibited for anyone to go to the Arctic without doing the observations. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said it's impossible. But technology is moving so fast now, so you could today you could put together an automated system that you could just put on a ship, and it would give you atmospheric and oceanic, to some extent at least, data without anyone really doing very much work. So ships of opportunity, all ships, all Arctic expeditions, all icebreakers going into the Arctic should be required to do at least a minimum of oceanic and atmospheric observations all the time. I completely agree.
And a follow-up question as well, is anyone doing data assimilation well? It seems to be an issue across observing systems.
That is an area where a lot of investment has been done and a lot of improvement also, but it's still not good enough. I find, for instance, since I'm an atmospheric expert, I find in the atmosphere, we talk a lot about how the huge amount of satellite data has improved data assimilation and weather forecasting. Well, that's true in the mid-latitude, but my feeling is that the vast amount of satellite data do only give us any good if there is also something else, if you also have in situ observation, and that's lacking in the Arctic. Unfortunately, to do data assimilation, you need both. You need three things. You need good observations, and you need a good data assimilation system, and you also need a good model. And neither of those are actually present in the Arctic. And I think we could already, with the existing knowledge and the existing technology, do a lot more if we were to focus on the Arctic. But most of these methods are developed for observation system with a different composition or different denseness. Satellite retrievals, I think if you were to do them Arctic specific, you could do a lot better than you're doing today, but no one is doing that because you need a system that is global. So data assimilation is coming very fast with reanalysis, etc. And there are several centers around the world doing that. Copernicus and ECMWF is one of the best, I would say, but I might get slapped on my fingers for saying that.
And then one comment, if you could provide a link to the full report in the chat box, is that possible, Michael?
Absolutely.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Any other questions from any of the audience here? Okay, if not, we are going to go on to our next and our final speaker, and this is Shelley Everham. Shelley has degrees in anthropology and history. She grew up in the North and returned to Nunavut in 2000. She strongly believes that community-driven research offers Indigenous peoples the opportunity to build capacity and create grassroots solutions to the social, cultural, economic, and environmental issues that exist in the Arctic. She's the lead for the Ikaarvik Barriers to Bridges team, and we asked Shelley to speak about that project and the work she's been engaged in to identify research priorities in Northern communities. So go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yep, all right, okay, thank you. I'm going to try to keep this to my 5 minutes, but I'm gonna tell you I tend to get very excited and possibly go on a little longer. I'm speaking to you today from Nunavut, one of the Inuit homelands in Canada, just an amazing place. I myself am not Inuit, but I consider myself to be a beneficiary of Inuit, and everything that's good in my life is because I have the incredible opportunity to live here and work with some spectacular people. So what I'd really like to talk to you today is about the way that you know, working with youth and engaging youth, you know, in kind of a different way, I guess, than the status quo would actually lead to the creation of better science, in our opinion. Our program is called Ikaarvik. In Inuktitut, it means a bridge. This is a program that was actually created by Inuit youth here in Pond Inlet, and it was really based on the gap that existed. Young people were seeing that so much research was going on, and that communities really, for the most part, were either engaged as skidoo drivers and camp cooks or being treated as data. What they sought was a solution to figure out ways to actually really meaningfully empower communities to set their own research priorities and act on those. You know, of course, one of the side benefits to that is that, you know, you have the opportunity for youth then to really develop and acquire transferable skills. For most of the communities that we work with through the Ikaarvik program, these are communities with really poor education systems, world's crappiest internet, and honestly, very low levels of information flowing into the communities. And, you know, rather than expecting youth to leave their communities to acquire these skills, we look as research as a way to be able to bring these skills into the communities. Why youth? Well, it's funny that the parts of this panel is that it's about resource development. And I think the Arctic's greatest resource is actually youth. In Nunavut, for instance, 60% is under the age of 30. And, you know, I'm sure that there's different statistics all around the Arctic, but the reality is, if you're looking to engage communities, you really need to be engaging youth to do that properly. The way that Ikaarvik works is that we go in with a pretty simple premise, and that's, if research was completely up to youth, what are the issues that they would be identifying? In our workshops, youth identify what are known as the strengths of Inuit Kalyamaya Tukhangit, which is IQ, shortened to IQ, and also the strengths of science. And what happened there a little bit unexpectedly was the youth actually looked at these two lists and said, yeah, but it's kind of stupid. Why is everybody treating these like they're two separate things? What we should be doing is using the best of these two ways of knowing. And instead of sort of trying to cram them together and incorporate Indigenous knowledge, why don't we zip them up in a way that's complementary? And I'll talk a little bit more in this presentation about the concept that the youth actually developed, which is called PsyQ. Once the youth have created their list of community priorities, they then have to present it to the elders and the hunters and their community. And of course, they're terrified. But you know, by the end of the community meetings, what they come up with is a list that's created on consensus. It's what everybody agrees are the most pressing issues for their communities. Once the communities have agreement on what their priorities are, we then take a lot of care in connecting the communities and the youth with the right kind of researcher, not somebody who's just looking for a research assistant. We are not in the business of creating research assistants. We are creating co-researchers. The incredible value that these young people bring to the table is, I mean, it's almost impossible to tell you about it. You really need to be there to see how the youth actually are in a position to put their arm around the researcher and go, look, we got you, but your questions aren't good. We need to rejig this. We need to come up with questions that actually work. Your methodology, I see that you put some time into it, but it's not going to work. And so what happens is the power starts to shift from a case where a researcher would typically come in with a fully formed question and methodology and methods for doing analysis, and the youth are actually able to take it and turn it into something that really works from the community perspective. We're really proud that, unlike a lot of the status quo where Indigenous peoples in the North are used to help a researcher collect their data, the youth are involved in all stages of the research, from developing the questions and the methodology all the way through to the analysis and the ultimate communication of the research. And I think, you know, from my experience, it's having communities actually involved in the analysis that's has some of the greatest value. I think this is one of the greatest areas of concern for communities, that researchers come up and they take data and then they go somewhere else and then they tell you what it means. And, you know, very often from the community perspective, they're not really getting the true story. So the youth are a great way to ensure that community viewpoints are included in the analysis as well. A couple of examples, we work with 4 communities in Nunavut territory and have recently been invited to start working in the Yukon. We don't go anywhere without being invited. We're not just going to show up and, you know, tell people that they need to be doing this kind of stuff. But communities tend to find out what we're doing and then want us to come over. And there was a big cat that just popped up. I don't know if you guys can see it, but Stephanie's cat just poked her head in. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the amazing work that the youth are able to do. And again, please keep in mind that in a lot of these remote high Arctic communities, you know, some of these youth may have graduated from high school, but some of them haven't. We don't differentiate. We look at research as a really powerful place to be able to acquire skills. In Pond Inlet, one of the biggest issues that was identified by the youth was concerns over increased shipping and the myriad of impacts that come from that. So the youth have been trained to be working alongside a Department of Fisheries and Oceans biologist to collect environmental DNA. And one of the neat things is they've been able to extend the season of data collection into, as you can see, into the early winter, whereas typically the DFO biologists would have been there only during the open water season. In Salluit in northern Quebec, Joe Haven and Pond Inlet in Nunavut, the youth were able to work on behalf of their communities and with their communities to be able to inform the development of the Transport Canada's proposed shipping corridors through the Canadian Arctic. In this instance, it really demonstrates how working with the communities has allowed a very proactive type of research rather than waiting to determine what the impacts are later. Youth are able to guide their communities to be heard in the process of setting those shipping corridors. In Kugluktuk-Nunavut, the youth identified that the health of the Coppermine River was of utmost importance, and they are on a 3-year program now that is completely run by their community now to develop and implement their monitoring program. And, you know, it's really amazing to watch these young people, you know, not just going and setting up the monitoring equipment, but actually learning how to analyze the data that comes from the monitoring equipment. And again, you know, in a typical scenario in Nunavut, these youth may or may not have had a job with a researcher, but typically it would have been just ferrying them out in their boat to go and dump their monitoring equipment, and they never would have actually been able to participate in the actual research. This is one we're really proud of our association. Smart Ice is a program that combines Inuit knowledge and technology. It's a pretty simple technology, actually. It's a salinity sensor that gets pulled on the back of the snowmobile and sends the information to a tough pad mounted right on the snowmobile. So as soon as the signal passes through the sea ice and hits the salt water, it bounces back up, so you know in real time how thick the ice is. This is an absolutely fabulous, amazing program that is saving people's lives. I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that the young man to the left is one of the co-founders of Ikaarvik and is now the Smart Ice regional coordinator, and has received a United Nations award for his work, and also the 2019 Governor General's Award for Innovation. So again, you know, you take a really small remote community, research is giving young people an absolutely fabulous place to shine and doing, you know, quality of work that is just unparalleled. As I said, we're now moving into the Yukon. It sounds like we're spreading like COVID-19. Not quite that fast, but we are now doing something pretty neat, which hasn't been done to my knowledge in Canada, which is connecting Inuit youth with First Nations. And in the Yukon, the youth have identified traditional ways that their First Nations would have kept waterways clear in order to improve salmon spawning success. And they would like to develop a system that uses technology and traditional knowledge to be able to monitor the success of utilizing those Indigenous techniques for salmon stream management. I think the really impressive thing here is that the youth have identified that creating opportunities for youth to connect with each other means that it allows the youth to stand united on issues that are important. And, you know, in this case, salmon is one that unexpectedly in the last couple of years has been linking the Yukon and Nunavut. Kugluktuk and Cambridge Bay aren't supposed to have salmon, and the Yukon is. And while the Yukon salmon numbers are declining, salmon are starting to show up in Kugluktuk and in Cambridge Bay. And so it's giving these youth a way to connect on the issues that are of utmost importance. And what they really want to do is be able to capitalize on the fact that bridging across the Arctic and connecting the youth is probably a way to really maximize the impact of what they're doing. So as I mentioned, the youth also, while we were going through our workshops and thinking about the strengths of science and the strengths of Inuit Kalyumaya Tukangit, or Inuit traditional knowledge and values, came up with this concept that they named PsyQ. You know, typically when we talk about capacity building, it's always sort of a, you know, you got to build capacity in northern research, and everybody assumes that means you need to build the ability of Indigenous people to work as research assistants, or to, you know, take measurements or do whatever they're going to do. And I'd invite you to consider that capacity building should be happening both ways. And the youth have really put their finger on something important, which is, for the most part, the relationship with research hasn't necessarily always been a smooth one, and that they really felt that as part of the bridging, that youth have a role to play in building capacity of researchers to work in a smoother way with Indigenous communities. And so PsyQ is a concept that they developed, which is inviting researchers to consider that Indigenous knowledge is not just data. You know, unfortunately, a lot of the experience that they've had is that researchers will come up expecting that Indigenous knowledge is something you just circle on a map. The youth have identified that following Indigenous knowledge and really understanding Indigenous knowledge is a way of informing how you create the relationships to get to the point where you have mutual understanding and trust, and then you can start talking about the data. And so the youth, we were able to bring the youth together, and they created a protocol that has 41 specific actions that a researcher can take before, during, and after their research to really I guess rather than having a researcher try to interpret what it means to utilize or incorporate Indigenous knowledge, the youth have said, here, don't try to guess, we're going to tell you what it means. And so they've created this guide, and it's been absolutely fantastic. We've had great uptake on this one, and I'm really excited to see where it's going to go. It's also been really inspiring for the youth that we work with in the Yukon. They also want to develop a similar Yukon-specific set of protocols. So, you know, like, why are you guys supposed to care? Well, I mean, honestly, I think there's that sense sometimes in Arctic research that when you talk about Indigenous peoples or Indigenous research or Indigenous needs, everyone sort of pats you on the head and goes, oh, that's nice. That's like citizen science. And it's, again, I'm going to invite you to think about this a little differently, is that when I start an Ikaarvik workshop, the first thing I mention to these kids is that they are descendants of the original Arctic scientists. That when you think about research and you think about observing and monitoring and testing, this is exactly what their ancestors have done. And that's the reason that they're able to be sitting in that workshop with me, is that these really are the original Arctic researchers. And when we flip things around and we allow youth to be that bridge, you create a different kind of functional relationship between research and the North. You know, obviously there's personal and professional development. Decolonization of research isn't something we set out to do, but it's been happening, and it's pretty fabulous to watch. I think really it's just, I am really proud to watch the youth being able to tell researchers that if you consider working in a different way with communities, your research is going to be more efficient, more effective, and ultimately you're just going to have better science. You know, the value of youth as a bridge is that ultimately they can take these two ways of knowing and zip it up to create better knowledge. So what's next? Well, the youth have really stated that their objective is ultimately to create a network of Indigenous youth researchers across the circumpolar world. We just got to make sure it's not from my kitchen table, because workspace is at a premium up here. And my last screen, because I have to stick in my adorable child, is to show you how many people and agencies and groups have seen the value in working differently in the North. You know, starting with the Arctic Inspiration Prize, which allowed us our initial funding, all the way through to, you know, the various different programs that have funded us and the research partners that we have. I think the big lesson here is that, you know, I can't speak for the rest of the Arctic, but definitely within Canada, there is a real hunger to try to create research that is relevant and meaningful and ultimately better than what's been done before, and that people want youth to succeed. They want to create opportunities, and honestly, now that this door has opened, I just see nothing but amazing opportunities for youth in Arctic research. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shelley. We do have one question from Sean Topcock asking if the guide with the 41 actionable items by youth is available publicly.
Yeah, it's actually on the resource page, but I will also, I will pull that up.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then another question from Lisa Lissetto. Great talk as always, she says. Lots of questions. First, I'm curious about the participation of Inuit in the interpretation of data. This is something we're trying to do. Can you provide guidance, specifics? Second question, through working with youth, have you found barriers or bridges when connecting to research outcomes to decision-making bodies like land claim boards? So 2 questions. Participation in the interpretation of the data, and then the second part is the barriers connecting research outcomes to decision making.
Yeah, I think, you know, with the interpretation of data, definitely I'm not a scientist, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm not the most clever person in the world. I think one of the things that that is really critical is being able to provide people with enough of the back information in a way that's clear and understandable. You know, I know that it's a real struggle when we've got really poor education system in Canada's north. I can't speak to the rest of the Arctic, but that's something that I just find is, yeah, it's challenging, but in order to, I think, ultimately have Inuit involved in all stages of research, more care and time needs to be given to that. I'd love to see more connection between research and some of the research funding agencies and the schools in the north, to be able to give people some more basic education that would allow them to kind of transition more easily into some of this interpretation. Yeah, that's a tough one, Lisa, and I think Eric and Heidi Swanson with the Kugluktuk project could answer that one a little better than I could, because they've just been running through this right now in terms of interpreting the data. Your second question, through working with youth, have you found barriers or bridges? I like your terminology when trying to connect to research outcomes to decision-making bodies like land claim boards. Ooh, you know what? It's really interesting is that in some ways I'm finding it's a bigger struggle to deal with sort of the regional bodies rather than the national. I think national and specifically academic institutions, it's been a lot easier. The land claim boards, that's a different one. That's a little outside of, you know, Nunavut already has a settled land claim. So I don't really have a lot of experience with something like that.
Okay, a question from Vito Vitali from Italy. It would be nice to increase the technological level of cooperation and bring the local people more in the work, giving them responsibility for maintenance of simple as well as complex instrumentation. How to act to understand the level of competencies and or put in place actions to improve them. So how do you kind of increase that technological level?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I guess this is one of the big dilemmas is, you know, when you're talking about things like complex instrumentation, to what end? I mean, really, what we try to do is focus on the needs that and the research priorities identified by the communities, and often that doesn't involve a lot of this complex instruments. I think the thing again to be aware of is that, you know, the status quo is having somebody else's research agenda coming in and having people respond to it. For the work that we do, it really is not it's not a case of somebody else's instruments being out there and asking people to be responsible for them. So, you know, maybe there's a bit of a split here, because most of the work that we're doing doesn't require that kind of technical ability, but when it does, we just make sure to support people and train in a way that is culturally appropriate and that really, you know, doesn't make people feel stupid. Because I think that's the other part of it, is that there's so much technology involved in research that just makes people feel really stupid. So yeah, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but yeah,
Can I say something?
I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think this is, first of all, I think we should realize that observations are observations and research is research. Some observations make research possible, but the observations themselves are typically not research. So I think what you're talking about, Shelley, is research that is directly beneficial to the communities. And it's quite understandable that that is the focus. That is the thing that you need to do to get them involved. And that is, so the question is the answer in a way. You need to do that type of research for them to get involved. And when they get involved, you can do a lot more other things as well. But Vito is correct. Vito is correct also in the sense that there are types of measurements and observations that you need to do every day for 30 years for them to be useful. And that's a different type of observations. And if we could bridge the gap so that also local communities could be participants in both of these things, I think would be a great thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the barriers to that, in my experience, is the fact that, you know, very often when someone comes in and has this like incredible tech and they're measuring something like black carbon, there hasn't been enough good communication that allows people to know that they're actually doing something that is of local interest. Ocean acidification is another great example. I think the first Arctic Science Summit I went to, everyone was talking about ocean acidification. And my comment was, there's no way that youth are ever going to put this up as a community priority because they've never heard of it. You know, if it's not something that's showing up locally on people's radar, it just means that ultimately the research community needs to do a better job in bringing information in. Because I think once communities understand why you're measuring that, whatever it is that you're measuring, once you find that common ground, it becomes a no-brainer. But truly, most researchers haven't learned how to talk in a way that you would talk to your grandmother. And I love to tease people when they come in and they blah, 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 blah. And I say, really, your grandmother must love that. And they're like, oh, well, I don't tell my grandmother this. I'm like, well, why would you tell these grandmothers this? I think if there's one piece of advice I could give would be to just talk about it in the way that you are passionate about what you do. Because I think the minute people get excited about what they're doing and why they're doing it, then we all sort of connect as human beings. But to this point, there is a lot of interest in hiring Indigenous people to do things like monitoring, and yet there's not enough good, clear explanation as to what you're monitoring and why, to even get people interested to be doing that, let alone try to tackle the technology.
So it's partly a packaging problem. Then if you want to have salinity, or if you want to have ocean acidity, you need to bring it in with something that is relevant for the community in a package, so that they understand the totality of the thing. That's the one thing. The other thing is just communication, and that's a lesson for everyone every day in all communities. And if you can't explain your science to your grandmother, you shouldn't be doing it.
Well, and also if you can't explain why your science matters or why you care so darn much about it. And I think when you watch people get excited and they're able to light up about the work that they're doing, I think that's when you connect as human beings, and anybody would want to help you out. But again, that's I think one of the neat things about the document that the youth have created is SciQ actually says, we're not expecting you to know how to work with an Indigenous community, but here, we're gonna tell you the 41 no-fail steps to learn how to sit down and have a conversation. Because once there's this mutual understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, people lean in right away, and they don't want you to fail. And I think that's the other side of it, is the lost opportunities by not having that kind of conversation with Northern communities means you miss the opportunity to have a team behind you that actually really wants you to succeed.
So I'm going to skip then to Meredith LaValle's question, because that ties right into this, that she calls this a great and helpful framing of what often can feel like an intractable problem. Can you say more? And maybe I'll open this up to the entire group too, the other panelists as well. Can you say more about capacity building in the research community for zipping in IQ, perhaps creating more exposure to Northern languages, or building understanding of cultures and local tribal governance structure, other types of trainings? How do you then communicate with the research community? And I'm gonna open that up. And is there anyone else? Because we're down to our last 10 minutes, so I wanna make sure that there's some other discussion from the rest of the participants as well, the panelists. Any of you other panelists wanna comment on that? Stephanie, you took yourself off mute.
I'll just say, well, I think there's definitely a need for that. And one of the things that Shelley said was about it's more than just a one-way street. It's, I would say, even more than a two-way street of learning. You need to have multiple different views and perspectives at the table, and understand that they all are valid, and that by including all of them, you're going to have better science, right? And you're going to have better, not just better engagement, but better science and better data and better all of that. And so there definitely needs to be training. I also want to put on the table that it's necessary for funders as well, and for the funding agencies to have a better understanding of what engagement looks like, and what they're doing when they're setting their funding agendas. And we've seen the repercussions of that from the NSF in terms of their dumping of money into their navigating the new Arctic, and then some other engagements that other entities have done. And so how do we begin to conduct those trainings or build up that capacity on the researcher side without at the same time overburdening communities, right? And leaning on them to do that. And so I think that's kind of the crux of where we need to move forward and figure out who can be doing that. And some of it already goes on, but there's a definite strong need for more.
So I want to throw out. Yeah, go ahead, Sally. Go ahead.
Well, I think the case about overburdening communities. People talk about research fatigue, and the thing we found is exactly the opposite. When it's your research and your concerns and your needs that are being met, people are just like thrilled. But in terms of the, building capacity with researchers, which, I don't know if anyone's ever sort of framed it in that way, but, when we talk about research and capacity building in the North, it really should be equally about building the capacity for researchers to work in the North. And one thing that our program does is we work a lot with early career researchers. We'll go to conferences and we'll go to universities and actually work with them. And one of the things we do is involve a lot of humor with it. So like the first 5 minutes, we'll just speak in Inuktitut. And then people are like, wow, Indigenous language. And then they start looking for the interpreter. And then they're like kind of getting weirded out because they don't know what's going on. And we plant people in the audience to ask questions. And then, someone else will stand up and be like slow clapping. And the minute these guys start feeling left out of the conversation, they start getting irate. And then, as soon as people get really twitchy, I go, oh goodness, I'm sorry. Like, you didn't realize this session, like if you're going to work in the North, you need to understand Inuktitut. And then everyone's kind of faces go white. And I say, no, just joking, but how does it feel to feel stupid and not be able to follow a conversation? Because that's exactly what you do when you come into a community and you can't shed your academic persona, that you can't speak in a way that's accessible to people. And I think that kind of lesson and that kind of gentle poking and ribbing has worked really well. It gets the early career researchers to really think about how they're delivering their messages and how they're talking. So like, don't talk about cryosphere, just say ice. It's not rocket science, but it really works well.
Okay, and I know Olivia wanted to make a comment too. So go ahead, Olivia.
Yeah, just really quickly in terms of opportunities to build capacity for researchers to work a little more respectfully with communities. The UArctic, we recently established a new thematic network on community-based observing to inform natural resource management. And the training is emphasized on resource managers and researchers to understand what sort of observing activities are of interest and how to tie that into their science and their decision making. And then I'll just quickly also say that, we focus a lot on doing science that we think communities would find, interesting, how we package it. But, there's also maybe value in providing some just off the wall topics just to see if somebody in a community, some youth in a community might find interesting. I mean, you don't know what kind of science you might find interesting unless it becomes something that's introduced to you. So I would, recommend scientists who are interested but don't know if their science is immediately of relevance to communities to reach out, at least just test the waters.
So you have to put a call out for off the wall scientists, which
Once
I'm
in a
sure there are a lot of. Yeah. So my question, and this kind of ties into Michael's presentation on the assessment of gaps in sustainability. How a lot of these kinds of projects, are they short term? Are they really sustainable in the long term? What are your thoughts on sustainability?
Are you referring to the projects that were in my presentation?
Yeah, the kind of projects that you're working with, working really closely with communities, with youth. A lot of those tend to be funded by foundations or research components. They tend to be shorter term. Is that okay? Are we looking at trying to make them sustainable and really contribute to this kind of long-term knowledge of the Arctic kind of writ large?
Well, I think if you look at defining long-term, one of the amazing things is it actually is long-term, because what Indigenous knowledge is able to bring in is rather than look at a project and say, okay, here's 3 years, now let's extend it forward. We're also looking at the fact that here's 3 years and we're extending it back 500 years. So I think that when you're looking at time depth, what Indigenous knowledge is able to add to that story is an incredible time depth and knowledge that goes that way. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on sustaining these networks looking forward, and not enough conversation about the fact that Indigenous knowledge gives you the time depth in the other direction. So I think that's, I'm not so worried if things are only, a 1 or 2 year project. The reality is we're actually dealing with more funding than we can actually keep up with. Like I said, in Canada, we've got a really strong government that's really emphasizing reconciliation and really meaningfully creating positive things with Indigenous peoples. And so we're not struggling for funds, which is great. We're just trying to bring up our capacity to meet the needs, because we have so many communities that want to be able to do the same thing. But yeah, I think time is an interesting one, as long as we also consider that the past is equally important in those networks of observing.
Okay, I'm gonna open it back up. We have 3 minutes. So I think what we should do is just go to the other speakers and give them one last chance to say one minute, one final comment from this session that will wrap it all up for us. So I'm gonna go first to Stephanie, and then to Michael, and then to Olivia.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me on this. And I was very interested and engaged to hit on a lot of topics throughout the presentations that I think draw back to some of the things that I was talking about. Particularly, I know Michael brought up the issues around the quality of data, which is something that we're also concerned about in terms of thinking through Indigenous data sovereignty. So not only focusing on people and purpose, but also enriching data so that it's accessible and findable and usable in these different data ecosystems. And then really thinking through how data is about people at all times, even when we're talking about Earth observations, or we're talking about mammals, that we are talking about people and our relationships with the natural world, and our responsibilities. And so I just want to underscore that and thank everybody for sharing their work today.
Thank you, Stephanie. Michael?
Thank you. I think the fast changes in the Arctic is representing a challenge that necessitates us to do research that may not necessarily always seem relevant to the local communities. And there are types of observations that has to be done to meet that challenge, whether it is something that is appealing or not appealing. So I think we just have to think out of the box and not get bogged down by how we think that networks are supposed to look and be operated, and just try and do novel things and do them fast. So don't invent the wheel. Try and do, if you want to invent something, let it be something else than a wheel.
Okay. Olivia.
Yeah, I think my comments pretty much follow what Michael was saying. You know, there's ways to be creative about how to get observations that we need that people find really pressing. And at the same time, you know, not to focus too much or worry too much about how to make everything tie together, because there will still be things that operate in a patchwork, and that's okay. But as long as we're always open to bringing in these smaller observing projects to a bigger network when it seems like it makes sense, but don't try to force it. Yep.
Great. Any last comments, Shelley?
Yeah, I want to say thank you, and you know, really don't underestimate the power of young Indigenous people to really be able to create better science for the North.
Right. Very, very wise words. And one of the questions was, what is the age group for youth? And I was thinking, what happens when youth kind of age out? Or do they ever, or do they just become us when they age out?
Well, in Nunavut, youth goes up to age 30. So once they're over 30, most of them keep sticking around and they become mentors. You know, that's the neat thing, is that, you know, they have the opportunity to do their own projects if they want. And a couple of my former students have been doing their own research, but a lot of them just really find great purpose in representing their community's needs and in mentoring the next generation.
Okay, well, thank you to all of the panelists. These were great presentations, and this has all been recorded and the chat's all been recorded. We didn't get to a couple of the questions, so I hope some of you can respond to those later, but thank you very much. This was a great session. Thank you so much for your time, especially those who are in the middle of the night.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
And thanks to our audience too, and participants.